Welcome to this episode of the Christopher Hall Training Podcast, where we're going to be talking about bracing. It's something that's involved in lower back pain, core strength, core stability. So what we're going to try and do is find out what it is, why it works, some of the differences between bracing and hollowing, and then we're going to apply it to exercise, movement, and sports. In part one, we're going to be talking about what is an abdominal brace. So we're going to start introducing some anatomy and start putting together some functions of what it is and how it works. So we're talking about the torso, but mainly the abdominal wall, and we're going to also be focusing in on the spine. So the ultimate, I guess, sort of two roles of abdominal bracing is number one, to stabilise the spine, and number two is energy transfer, if you will. And that means going from legs into the arms or arms down into the legs. And that could be for everyday movements like walking and running, lifting, carrying, whatever it may be, and then moving into exercise where we've then got loads involved. So that could be like a deadlift exercise, or it could be something a little bit more dynamic like a chopping type of exercise, which involves a rotation. Then you can then start talking about, because they're very similar, sporting types of movements like throwing and kicking and things like that. So with regards to a brace, and I guess when we're talking about the spine, how does it stabilise the spine first of all? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to break up into two systems. We're going to break it up into a passive system. We're going to break it up into an active system. So the passive system is kind of what it describes. It's the bones and it's the ligaments. They are just passive tissues. They have a degree of structural integrity, but they just kind of sit there. So that's why they would be known as passive. Then we've got an active tissue, which are the muscles. So they are more active. They respond to loads, they respond to posture and things like that, and they act on the spine. So what we're going to try and do is build, first of all, the passive tissues, which are the vertebra, the discs, and the ligaments. So from that perspective, from the passive perspective, we think of the spine as sort of blocks just loaded on top of each other. So you've got a block, then you've got, let's just say, like a rubber disc in between, and then you've got another block, another rubber disc, another block, another rubber disc. So if we were just to stand that up, it would be a very unstable structure, because it's just one block stacked on top of another with these like rubbery discs in between. So it can wobble, but if you push it, it will probably fall over. What we can then do is then add the ligaments. So we've got a ligament going up the front of the spine, and we've got a ligament going up the back of the spine. So if we then take, I don't know, a strip of tape, for example, and tape the front of the spine together and tape the back of the spine together, what we've done is we've created a degree of stability. So it's more stable than it was without that. So the ligaments, or the tape in our metaphor, are offering a small amount of stability. So if we push it, it won't just crumble. If we push it a little bit, it will probably stay there, but if we push it a lot, it will fall over. So it's offering a degree of stability. So that's the passive tissues. What we can now do is we can now add in the active tissue. So we've got the muscles. So we've got quadratus lumborum. We could have rectus abdominis. We could have transverse abdominis. We can have the obliques. We can have the erector spinae group, or the lumbar sections of the erector spinae group. And again, what we've got there are these active tissues that join onto the vertebra to, again, offer more stability. So in our metaphor, what we would do is we've got our blocks with our rubber sort of sections in between. Then we've got our tape going up the front and going up the back to offer a little bit of stability. What we would then do is take like elastic bands and sort of screw in, or whatever, attach to each rubber block an elastic band. And with the elastic bands, not only do they come off and join on close to the spine, but they also join further away from the spine. So it's like guy wires on a tent, or sort of the wiring system that comes off a sail on a boat. So we've got these elastic bands, and what they have to be as well is tensioned evenly around, because if we've got tension on one side, it's going to pull it to that side. If we've got tension on the other side, it's going to pull it to that side. If we've got tension on the front, it's going to pull it forward, so on and so forth. So again, all these elastic bands that are joined on to each vertebra all the way up and close to the spine and further away, all of those elastic bands have to be evenly tensioned all the way around to maintain the structure being upright. So that is the role of the active tissues. That is the role of the muscles around the torso. So what we start to get are some of the principles of how the core works. So number one, the active tissues and how it works, and how we create stability in the spine, and eventually we'll talk about the energy transfer that comes from that. So what happens is when we tense the core, we need to tension it, because we talked about elastic bands, so we can create tension. So what we need to be able to do to hold the spine in place, create that tension, but again, it needs to be done evenly. So we don't put adverse stress on front, back, left, or right. So again, it needs to be the tension that we create and the stiffness that we create in the active tissues needs to be done evenly. So when we talk about doing that, we have to talk about all these different muscles, because they join onto the spine slightly differently. So we have to create the tension throughout the torso, throughout the rectus abdominis, the obliques, the erector spinae, the quadratus lumborum, so on and so forth. So when we dynamically load the torso, so that could be in different directions, could be more load on the right, could be more load on the left, could be more load to the front, more load to the back. What we've got to do is create tension to balance all of that out. So again, we're trying to create as even tension all around the torso, so when we go into dynamic movement, the body knows how to respond to it. So what we talk about is this tension that we're creating is known as stability. So it's stabilising the spine. So it's holding it and maintaining its position. So if you listen to a previous tutorial where I talked about neutral spine, the bracing is what holds that neutral spine in place. And when we create tension, it needs to be all the way around, and it needs to balance out. So again, if we push on the spine, it doesn't topple over. It doesn't put adverse stress or unnecessary stress around the spine, which is going to create a problem. So what we need to think about is, first of all, stabilizing the spine with the brace, which again is how we activate the tissues, how we activate the core around the spine. So to summarize part one, what we've started to do is create stability through stiffening of the torso muscles, which is known as an abdominal brace, which is going to hold the spine in place and minimize any sort of adverse or unnecessary loads in specific areas. So it's going to distribute load much more effectively. So what we've created is a stable spine. What we're now going to move on to is talking about energy transfer and how we can go about creating stability with regards to dynamic movement. And we're going to start this conversation by talking about hollowing and bracing. This will be a relatively brief conversation, because when people are told to do exercise, they're told to hollow the abdominals or draw in the abdominals. Now, the idea of this is to activate the muscle transverse abdominis, which connects into the abdominal fascia and the thoracolumbar fascia, which is essentially the same thing, because it's one unit with essentially the muscles sort of put into it. And that is meant to stabilise the spine. But what I'm hoping you've grasped, and I shouldn't have to explain this too much, is that from what I've described before in part one, sort of debunks a little bit the idea of hollowing the abdominals in order to stabilise the spine. Because in order to stabilise the spine, we need tension through our elastic bands all the way around. And if we're just trying to activate one muscle, then we're just activating some of those elastic bands, which is going to create unnecessary tension, an unnecessary load on the spine, because we're not tensioning all the way around. We're just bringing tension to a little part of that. So when we then go about movement, other parts are going to be left vulnerable, if you will. Now, with regards to what bracing does, that's stiffening the torso and it's tensioning those elastic bands, as I've mentioned. And what it's also doing, it's creating these things, if you will, called hoop stresses. So what you've got is when you go to lift something, you create, so when you tension the core and you go to lift, or you go to lift something, you're going to tension, the core is going to tension. So for example, if you were to get out of the seat now, so the seat that you sat in, and you just consciously pulled your navel towards your spine, which is apparently how you activate transverse abdominis, that you think is going to stabilise your spine. But when you go to initiate the movement, your body will unconsciously override that and you will tension your abdominals in a brace. Now, when it comes to movement, what we want to be able to do is do that unconsciously, but it's done proactively unconsciously. So what we need to be able to do is proactively do it consciously. So when you go to stand up, your body will naturally brace and it will tension to help with the lift. If you just stick with the hollow, it will compromise the spine, albeit you've been told or you've heard or whatever that it's there to stabilise, but it won't do that, because if you put any load through the spine, your body will naturally brace. What we then need to be able to do is consciously, sort of proactively brace, rather than it be a reaction in your body sort of reacting after the fact. It needs to be done before the fact, if you will, to give a true sort of protective energy transfer, protection and energy transfer. So stabilizing of the spine and the ability to transfer the energy through the torso. The other part to this is what it's also doing and what the brace allows to happen. So as loads get heavier, you need to brace more. So when you brace, you do it appropriate to the task. So if it's a light load, you lightly brace. If it's a heavy load, you do a heavy brace. With drawing in of the navel, that doesn't happen, because the body will automatically override the hollowing effect, or the drawing in of the abdominals. So it will brace sort of appropriately anyway. But all I'm saying is just do that proactively. So before you go to lift, brace consciously, then lift. Now, what this is doing is this is creating an intra-abdominal pressure. So there is a pressure being pushed out. What then happens with the brace, that braces the abdominals, which holds that pressure in. And the balance between those two forces of the abdominal brace being pulled in and the intra-abdominal pressure being pushed out is known as a hoop stress. So and that's what we need to train our body to do within the brace, to be able to lift loads appropriately and be able to brace appropriately for those loads. So we've got the abdominal muscle stiffening. We've got the which is the force sort of compressing. We've got the intra-abdominal pressing out. The balance between those two forces is the abdominal brace. That will offer a protection to the spine because it will hold it in place. But again, there can be loads that exceed depending on the strength and the fitness of the core. So we need to be able to brace appropriately, which is going to appropriately manage intra-abdominal pressures and create hoop stresses, which is going to protect the spine and allow those transfers of energy between the upper body and the lower body, or the lower body limbs, the legs, and the upper body limbs, the arms and the shoulders. So what we're now going to do in part 3 is talk more specifically about movement and how the bracing works with movement, exercise, and sports, which are all kind of the same thing. So we'll talk about movement first, and then we'll start adding in exercise and sports performance on top of that, because we will kind of build it. It will kind of mold into each other. So with regards to movement, so obviously movement is dynamic. We can move forwards and back, we can move sideways, and we can move in a rotation. So what's happening with all of that is, as we move forwards and back, load is being distributed throughout the core. As we move side to side, load is being moved throughout the core, but this time in a different direction. And when we rotate, load is being moved in a different direction. So our bracing needs to be dynamic as well. So what we need to be able to do is build that with exercise. We need to be able to build that dynamic loading of the torso. So when we talk about exercise, we need to train, number one, in forwards and back movements, which is what most of exercises are and what most of exercises do. But we also need to do it in the sideways movement and in the rotation movement. So we need to build that, because, for example, if I take the first exercise, the plank, that's going to load a lot of the front and the back of the core. If we then do a side plank, that's going to load most of the left and the right of the core, depending on which side you do the side plank. When we do a chopping type of movement, which is a rotation, it's going to move from the side to the front, back to the side again, and vice versa when we do the chopping movement. So what we need to be able to do is train the core in all of these different planes, so that when we go into movement in everyday life, could be carrying shopping bags, could be carrying a suitcase on one side, could be carrying shopping bags on both sides, could be carrying a child on one side, could be carrying a child on your shoulders, whatever it may be. There's all these different things. It could be lifting up lifting up shopping bags, could be lifting a box out of the back of a car. All these different things need to be taken into consideration when it comes to training and developing the torso. So as I mentioned in part 2, the first thing we need to be able to do is brace appropriately. So if it's a light dynamic movement like walking, for example, then we need to brace lightly. So again, we can consciously do that, and then eventually, as the body understands what it's doing, it will start to do that more naturally. So we go from that sort of conscious training to like an unconscious type of training, if you will. So we've got the dynamic loading, and we've got the appropriate bracing. The next thing that we have is when it comes into more sporting performance. So these are, say, quick movements, like a throw, for example. The core needs to be tuned. So what I've talked about so far is consciously locking the torso, and certainly in a plank and a side plank, holding that position. For walking, bracing lightly, holding that position and walking. When it comes to things like a sporting performance, which is much quicker, much more unconscious in some regards, the core needs to be tuned so it's able to do that in and of itself, because you're not going to have the time to think about it. So we need to tune the core to work very quickly. So what that means, if we take the throwing movement as an example, so most people think you throw with your arm, but what you're actually doing is you're throwing with your whole body, and it will start from sort of the hips and the lower body. So there's going to be a huge rotation through the hips, which is then going to transfer that up through the torso, down the arm, and if you've got a ball in your hand, through the hand to the ball and to wherever it's going. So it's a whole body movement. So what needs to happen is, as we sort of, prime the body and go into the sort of the backswing, if you will, you're going to tension, so the torso may be braced lightly all the way through this. So it might be braced, let's say 30% all the way through. Now, I don't know these numbers. I'm just using it as for the sake of the example. So let's just say throughout this whole throw, from the backswing all the way through, is braced 30%. So as we initiate the backswing, the core is then going to brace up to 70%. So as we initiate that backswing, it braces an extra 40% up to 70%. What then happens is as it goes back into the backswing, it will then bring that brace back down to 30%, let's say. Then as we get to the back of the backswing and we're fully, lengthened, it's going to go back up to 70%. And then as we come through the throw, it's going to come back down to 30%. And then as we let go of the ball, there's going to be another brace at the end as well. So there's essentially 1, 2, 3 braces throughout that throw. And that's what we need to tune, is the initial brace, the brace at the backswing, and the brace as we let go of the ball. So it's all the time, it's contract, relax, contract, relax. So we are bracing, but there's a tuning effect to it. And this is where we are able to move the spine. Because in the light braces, there's going to be changes in position of the spine, certainly when we throw. But when we initiate the back and the forward swing, that's when the spine locks in place for a split second, because that's where the load is, when we're changing direction during the throw. So when you hear about we have to move our spine is built to move, this, that and the other, in this specific context, it still needs the abdominal brace to be able to do so, to minimize load on it, so it's then able to perform these movements whilst minimizing risk of injury to it, if you will. So we have to take that into consideration when we're talking about it. And this is where exercise and formal sort of gym environment allows us to hone and tune that brace. So when it comes to a lift, like a deadlift, we just lock everything in, maintain a neutral spine, and we lift. And then we put the weight down. When it comes to sporting performance, because there's different dynamics to it, it's more about tuning, maintaining an initial brace, and then getting these little pulses, just where it goes 30%, jumps to 70, back down to 30, jumps to 70, back down to 30, jumps to 70, back down to 30. So hopefully what you start to gain now is an understanding more of how the brace works throughout dynamic movement, because so much of it gets lost in this argument between we should maintain a neutral spine, no we shouldn't, because our spine is built to move and we need to move our spine. So at the moment, everyone's talking about neutral spine versus movement, whereas there is no neutral spine versus movement. It depends on the context in which the spine is being used and in what way the core is being used. In a sporting environment, yes, you can move it, and in some respects, in some exercises, you can move it, but you have to have that bracing tuned to be able to deal with it so the spine doesn't get damaged, because it's that transfers the energy. And if you don't get the tuning right, you get an energy leak that comes out of the torso where the tuning isn't correct. What then happens is that reduces the performance, and some of that energy can get transferred onto the spine and give it an adverse load and an unnecessary load that can be injurious to the spine. So you kind of got all these different contexts in which it needs to be used. But what we're trying to understand mostly is how we use the torso, and it's not neutral spine versus movement of the spine, if you will. So hopefully by understanding that, you can, or by understanding what we've talked about in this whole podcast, is you could start to understand where you use the spine and how you use the spine in different contexts. So again, just to summarize everything that we've talked about, number one, a brace is initial stability to the spine. It's not the same as hollowing, because we aren't bringing tension to these elastic bands all around the spine. We're just bringing tension to some of the elastic bands around the spine, which makes it not as stable. And then when it comes to movement, we need to brace consciously first, and then that tunes the unconscious bracing, if you will. So we pre-brace or proactively brace, or whatever you want to call it. And then when it comes to movement, we need to brace appropriately to the load. So if it's a heavy load, heavy brace. If it's a light load, it's a light brace. And then when it comes to more dynamic, sporting type movements, we need to tune the brace from that 30% to 70% back to 30%. So that relaxation to contract, relax, and we can do that in a formal gym environment with exercise. If you go to my How to Build Core Strength and Stability program, which you can find in the link below, you can start that journey of bracing up into up through stabilizing, building endurance, building strength, and then building that tuning at the end in the more advanced workouts as well. So hopefully this episode has been helpful for you. Hopefully you've learned something new. If you have a comment, please do leave it down in the comment section below, or a question. If you've enjoyed the content, hit the like button. If you want to watch more of this, or tutorials or episodes like this, hit the subscribe button and the bell icon. And if you want to help support the channel, hit the thanks button below, and your contribution will be greatly appreciated. So that's Chris from Christopher Hall Training. I'll speak to you in the next episode.